She buried the ledger on a Sunday, not in the earth. She was not so foolish as that, but in the lining of her traveling coat, 3 careful stitches along the seam where the wool was doubled and thick, pressing the oilskin flat against her ribs, the way a person presses a hand against a wound they are not ready to show anyone. She did it by lamplight in the back room of the Abilene rooming house, with a needle she had borrowed from the landlady under the pretense of a loose button. And when it was done, she put on the coat and stood at the window and looked at the Kansas night and thought, now you are the only thing standing between what he did and what he gets away with. It had been 11 days since her husband died. The official account was a heart seizure recorded in Dodge City by a physician who had been a guest at Congressman Harlan Vetch's dinner table 3 weeks prior, and who could be relied upon apparently to make the death of a man of 39 years look entirely unremarkable. Eliza had stood at that graveside in the October cold, with her veil pressed against her face by the Kansas wind, and watched Vetch weep with the technical proficiency of a man who had calculated the exact volume of grief required by the occasion, and produced it precisely, not a drop more, not a trace less. She had watched him look at her across the open grave. She had seen him register in that brief measuring glance that she might be a problem. She had been right. 2 days later, a man she did not recognize stood across the street from the rooming house, where she was still settling Declan's affairs, reading a newspaper that he never once turned a page of. The day after that, a different man arrived asking questions at the county clerk's office about the property filings her husband had been reviewing before his death. She had not waited for a third. Her name had been Eliza Crane, before her marriage daughter of a Kerrville land surveyor who had died, leaving her nothing but a methodical mind and the ability to read a deed filing in the dark. Her name had been Eliza Holt for 3 years, the years of her marriage to Declan Holt, a federal land administrator in Dodge City who had been, she came to understand in a long series of small and painful comprehensions, a man of considerable intelligence and modest courage, which is a combination that in certain circumstances can prove fatal. I had known what Vetch was doing for almost a year before he died. Had known and had sat on the knowledge the way a man sits on a hot stove, unable to stay but terrified of moving. He had taken careful notes. He had gathered the numbers. He had annotated every fraudulent land grant with his small accountant's hand, and his particular habit of underlining the specific date discrepancy twice, as though the first underlining might have been an accident and the second confirmed intent. And then he had come home on a Tuesday night with mud on his boots and the look of a man who has finally done his arithmetic and found the answer unacceptable. And he had pressed the ledger into her hands and said, "Keep this out of sight." He had said, "Don't trust anyone near the federal building." He had said her name once very quietly with an expression she recognized as close to the nearest he had ever come to an apology. He had not been a bad man. He had been a man who was afraid, which is different, though not always different enough. 3 days after the funeral, she had opened the ledger. She had spent 4 hours with it. Then she had sat in the still room listening to the night outside and thought with the cold, specific clarity that had always been her most reliable quality. I know what this is. I know who did it. And if I stay here, I am next. She had packed before dawn. She had been moving ever since. Abilene, then Wichita, then Amarillo. She carried the ledger in the coat lining and $300 in gold coin distributed between her boot heel and the false bottom of her carpet bag. And she moved west. The way water moves when everything slopes, not because of choice precisely, but because west was the only direction that still had room. She was in the Amarillo Stage Depot, reading the classified notices of the Territorial Dispatch, when she found the advertisement from Cutter's Fork, New Mexico Territory. She read it twice, then she read it a third time. Most advertisements of that type announce themselves with the anxious enthusiasm of a man who understands he is asking for something large and is trying to obscure that understanding with flowery language. This one was different. It stated facts. A rancher named Sam Garrett owned 600 acres along the Cimarron Breaks, had a water dispute that had been bleeding him for 6 years, and required a practical-minded woman willing to work the partnership rather than ornament it. He offered a fair arrangement, a house his word, and the unadorned acknowledgement that he was 38 years old and had no romantic illusions to sell. I use the word partnership. She cut it out with her penknife. She looked at it for a long time on the stage platform in Amarillo, with the October wind full of alkali dust and the sound of horses and the particular fatigue of a woman who has been afraid for 11 days without a single moment's rest. She did not write back. She bought a ticket. She was done waiting for things to be decided. The town of Cutter's Fork announced itself as a collection of adobes and timber frames gathered around a central square. The way settlers gather around water, not by plan, but by the same logic of survival applied by everyone simultaneously until the thing exists. The stage rolled in on a gray Thursday noon, and Eliza stepped down to the packed earth with her carpet bag in one hand and the careful posture of a woman who has practiced not looking like what she is, a woman on the run, until the practice has become indistinguishable from the real thing. She stood on the plaza and looked up. She had not been prepared for the sky. Texas sky she knew, Kansas sky she had lived under. But this sky over the Cimarron country was a different order of sky entirely, something that did not merely exist above the land, but pressed down upon it with a patient, enormous weight, the blue of it, so saturated in the October afternoon that it seemed almost solid, something you could chip pieces from if you found the right angle. The land answered the sky with its own kind of permanence, red sandstone breaks running north and south, the silvery green of Chamisa along the dry creek beds, the distant suggestion of mountains going purple in the west. She stood there for 30 seconds, then she picked up her bag and went to find Sam Garrett. She found him, or rather she found his ranch by asking at the livery, where a taciturn man named Borrego, who spoke in statements of 3 words or fewer, established that the Garrett place was 4 miles north, and that the hired wagon would cost her 50 cents in the services of a boy named Tomas, who would have her there before the light changed. She thanked him and paid him and sat on the wagon bench and watched the country open around her as Tomas clicked to the horse and the town fell away behind the first rise. The land shifted as they climbed. The flat of the plaza country gave way to something older and more layered, the sandstone breaking through in long red shelves. Juniper on the slopes, the occasional cottonwood marking, where water moved underground even in dry country. She watched it and thought of her father, who had loved the specific intelligence required to read a landscape, to see in the surface features the story of what lay beneath, and who had taught her that the most reliable maps were not always the ones filed in county courthouses. The ranch appeared over a low rise, and she took it in the way she took in everything that mattered, completely, in one long, careful look without reaction. It was a working ranch, not prosperous in the way of Eastern money, but solid in the way of a man who has learned that solidity is its own form of wealth. Adobe main house, 2 outbuildings, a barn with a repaired section of roof, a corral holding 5 horses of obvious quality, a windmill turning with the slow, patient rhythm of machinery that has been maintained rather than ignored. The fencing was straight and tight. The yard was not swept, but the equipment was stored with the organized logic of someone who needed to find things in a hurry and had arranged for that possibility in advance. She was reading the ranch the way her father had taught her to read a land survey, from the perimeter inward, establishing the whole before the parts. When the front door of the house opened and a man came out, he stopped on the porch when he saw the wagon. She stopped reading the ranch and read him instead. How was tall, lean in the way that years of outdoor labor creates in a man, not the deliberate leanness of the fashionable East, but the particular economy of someone whose body has been shaped entirely by what it has been required to do. Dark hair gray, beginning to appear at the temples, a jaw that had probably always had that stubborn set and had only become more itself with time. He wore his work clothes, canvas trousers, a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows despite the October cold, with the unself-consciousness of a man who has not thought about what he was wearing in several years and has no immediate plans to start. I was watching her with an expression that was not quite wariness and not quite welcome, but something honest from a man who was not practicing it. The expression of someone who has committed to a thing and is now confronting the reality of what he has committed to. She stepped down from the wagon. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "I'm Eliza Holt." He came off the porch. He did not extend his hand immediately, which she noticed, and then he did, which she also noticed. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I expected a letter first." "I find letters slower than decisions," she said. "I hope that's not a problem." Something moved across his face that she could not yet interpret. He took her bag from Tomas, who accepted a coin and turned the wagon back toward town without apparent interest in whatever he was departing from. "Come in," Garrett said. "Coffee's on." The interior of the house told her what she needed in under a minute. A man living alone for several years, organized but not domestic. The kitchen functional and clean in the specific way of cleanliness that is about practicality rather than aesthetics. A bookshelf that had been used, the spines cracked, the order approximate rather than decorative. Maps on the kitchen wall. The territorial survey maps annotated in a careful hand, with the pencil marks of a man who had been fighting a legal battle long enough to learn the relevant documents and mark them up accordingly. She looked at the maps while he poured coffee. "The Cimarron water case," she said. He turned and looked at her. "It's on your wall," she said simply. "Has been for 6 years," he said. He brought the cups to the table. "Hennessy Land and Cattle has been contesting my North Spring access since 1877. 3 territorial court rulings all against me. My water rights are good. I know they're good, but I can't prove it in a court where the judge and the company have been acquainted since before I arrived here." She sat down and studied the nearest map. Something in the filing notation was familiar. She filed the familiarity away for examination. "Your advertisement said you needed someone who could read a legal document," she said. "I need someone who can read them and tell me what I'm missing," he said. "I've had 2 lawyers. One was no good and one was good, but couldn't fix a problem that doesn't have a legal solution from inside the territory." She looked at him. He met her gaze with the direct steadiness of someone who has decided that honesty is the only workable opening position and has committed to it. "What made you put the advertisement in a Panhandle paper?" she said. "Range," he said. "I wanted someone who didn't know anyone in this territory yet. No entanglements, no prior claims on her judgment." He paused. "That sounds cold." "It sounds practical," she said. "I understand practical." They drank their coffee in a silence that was not comfortable, but was honest, which was already more than she had expected. She thought about the ledger against her ribs. She thought about the man she had seen outside the Abilene rooming house, reading his unturned newspaper. She thought about what she could say here and what she should wait to say, and how to measure a person accurately in under an hour when so much depended on the measurement. "You have a daughter," she said. "Rosie," he said. "She's 11. She's at school now. She'll be back by 4. Something in his voice changed register when he said the name. The careful, assembled composure of a man managing a complicated situation became for a single, unguarded moment a man who was entirely and simply a father. She looked away quickly. It was too unguarded a thing to look at without feeling something, and she had told herself very firmly for 11 days that feeling things was a luxury she could not currently afford. "I have things to tell you," she said. "Not all of them tonight, but I want you to understand from the beginning that I didn't come here under entirely honest circumstances." She kept her voice level. "I came here because I needed somewhere to be, because I needed a legitimate reason to exist in a place where a certain man wouldn't look for me immediately." She set her cup down. "I'm not dangerous to you. I intend to honor the arrangement in full. But you should know before you decide anything that I'm carrying something with me that has made the past 11 days complicated." I was quiet for a long moment. "How complicated?" he said. "Considerably," she said. He turned his coffee cup once on the table. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the maps on his wall. "Are you wanted by the law?" he said. "No," she said. "The law is part of the problem, not the solution. At least the law as it exists in certain territories." He absorbed this. "I won't make you tell me tonight," he said, "but I'll need to know." "Yes," she said. "I know you will. I'm planning on it." She met his eyes. "I needed to see first whether you were someone worth telling." "And," he said, "the verdict isn't in yet," she said, "but I'm not leaving." Something almost happened in his expression. Not quite a smile. Nothing so assembled, but something that suggested the machinery of it existed somewhere in his face and had been invoked. "There's a room at the end of the hall," he said. "East facing. It's small." "Small is fine," she said. "I don't need much space." He stood and picked up both empty cups and took them to the wash basin, and did not say anything else about any of it, which struck her in the quiet, methodical way she processed important information as the most reassuring thing he had done since she stepped off the wagon. The room was spare, a narrow bed with a quilt worn thin at the edges, a window looking east toward where the Cimarron breaks caught the last October light in long amber shelves, a washstand, a hook on the wall. Someone had placed a small jar of dried prairie grass on the sill. She could not tell if this was an old habit or a deliberate gesture, and decided it did not matter. She set the carpet bag on the floor. She pressed her hand against the coat lining where the ledger sat flat and careful against her ribs. She was not safe. She understood that with the specific clarity of a woman who has stopped pretending that changing her location changes her situation. What she had purchased was time, distance, a room facing east. It was enough to begin. Through the wall, she could hear Garrett moving in the kitchen with the quiet, organized efficiency of a man who has been running his household alone for a while and has made certain accommodations to that solitude. She thought about what she had told him and what she had not. She thought about what her father used to say about maps, that the most dangerous thing about a bad survey wasn't what it showed you, but what it made you stop looking for. She rose. She smoothed her traveling clothes. She opened her door. In the kitchen, Garrett was at the table with a set of papers and a pencil, working through something with his particular expression of concentrated patience. He looked up when she appeared, but did not look surprised, as though he had been waiting for her to decide she was done staying in the room. "I'd help with supper," she said. "If there's anything wanting doing." "There's beans in the pot and cornbread started," he said. She found the relevant implements, found the cutting board, began doing what needed doing with the efficient movements of a woman who has spent enough years in kitchens to know how to occupy one without requiring instruction. She did not make conversation. He returned to his papers. The kitchen moved around them in the way a room moves when two people have independently decided that silence is more useful than the performance of ease. After a time, she said, without looking up from the cornbread pan, "The annotations on your survey map, the North Spring filing. What year did you first file the original deed?" She heard his pencil stop. "1872, he said. "And the Hennessy contest was first lodged in 1877, he said. 5 years after I had established use." She looked at the stove. She was thinking about a specific section of the ledger that Declan had annotated with his double underline. A pattern she had seen before. A pattern that she was beginning to understand, not limited to Kansas. "I'd like to look at those maps after dinner," she said, "if that's agreeable." He was quiet for a moment. "It's agreeable," he said. Rosie arrived at 4:15 on her pony, coming through the gate at a pace that suggested the concept of a trot was beneath her, slid down from the saddle with the boneless ease of a child who has spent more time on a horse than off one, and appeared in the doorway with her school satchel and a direct assessing gaze that reminded Eliza powerfully of her father in his better moments. She was 11 years old and small for it, dark-haired, with her father's stubborn jaw and gray eyes that were doing a rapid and thorough job of processing the woman standing in her kitchen. "You're the one from the advertisement," she said. "I am," Eliza said. "Eliza Holt. It's good to meet you." "Papa said you didn't write," Rosie said. Not accusatory, informational. "I didn't, I wrote instead." Rosie considered this. "He respects that more," she said with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child reporting established household fact. "He says people who write a lot of letters before they act are usually trying to make up their mind by making yours up for them first." Eliza glanced at Garrett. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man discovering that his child has apparently been cataloging his opinions and redistributing them to strangers. "Your father is not wrong," she said. Rosie gave her a long final assessment. Then she hung up her satchel and asked what she could do to help with supper. The question was asked with the practical efficiency of a child who has run her own household since the age of 8 and considers the question of whether she is willing to help to be entirely separate from the question of whether help is required. Eliza gave her the beans to stir. "You can ride," Rosie said as a statement. "I can." "How far?" "As far as necessary," Eliza said. "I was raised by a man who thought the ability to cover ground was the most useful thing a person could learn." Rosie was quiet for a moment. "Then Mrs. Calloway, who came last spring, couldn't ride at all. She also didn't know how to work a well pump. Papa had to show her 3 times." "I know how to work a well pump," Eliza said. Rosie looked up from the beans. Something in her expression shifted, the small, barely perceptible calibration of a child who has been watchful for a very long time and is in the early stages of deciding she can relax her attention. "All right," Rosie said. It was Eliza understood a considerable concession. The survey maps spread across the kitchen table after supper told her what she suspected, and it was worse than that. She had learned to read land surveys from her father, who had believed that precision was a form of respect and imprecision, a form of dishonesty, and who had taught her to look not only at what a document stated, but at what it assumed the reader would not notice. She looked now with both sets of eyes, her father's technical eye, and the eye she had been training for 11 days on the contents of Declan's ledger. There a filing date that did not match the corresponding territorial register entry. There a survey marker notation that appeared in the Hennessy contest documents under slightly different coordinates than in the original Garrett deed. And there, in the margin of the third territorial court ruling, And this was the thing that stopped her breath for a full 3 seconds, a case citation from the Dodge City Federal Circuit. She knew that citation. Declan had underlined it. Twice. She set the papers down very carefully. "What is it?" Garrett said. He had been watching her read with the particular focused patience of a man who has learned to give careful people room to be careful. He was not asking about the expression on her face. He was asking about the document. "The judge who signed your third ruling," she said. "Territorial Associate Justice Caleb Yarrow." "Yes," Garrett said. "He sits in the Dodge City Federal Circuit." "He did," Garrett said. "He moved his appointment south 14 months ago, to New Mexico and the Panhandle territories." A pause. "I found out from my neighbor Aldecoa last spring, sideways the way a man tells you something he's not comfortable knowing." Eliza looked at the ruling in her hand. "This isn't a coincidence," she said. "This is arrangement." She told him on the seventh day, not the whole of it. She had learned that the whole of a thing delivered at once has a way of overwhelming the capacity of even a careful person to properly assess it, but enough. She told him about Declan, about the ledger, about Congressman Vetch and the federal land grant funds that had been quietly rerouted over the course of 9 years through a series of territorial entities whose connections were invisible unless you had access to Declan's annotations and the specific training to read them. She told him about the man who had been watching the rooming house in Abilene. She told him about the stage platform in Wichita, where two of Vetch's men had tried to take the carpetbag by force, and she had looked them both level in the eye and told them in a voice with no theater in it at all that she would raise the kind of noise that would bring every bystander on the block running before she gave up an inch. And they had stepped back because sometimes the only thing standing between a person and what is done to them is the absolute clarity of their refusal. She told him that Yarrow's name appeared in Declan's ledger as a recipient of payments routed through a holding company that appeared under its third shell entity in the Hennessy Land and Cattle corporate filing from 1876. Garrett sat across from her at the kitchen table in the evening lamplight and listened to all of it without filling the silence with managing responses, without performing concern or reassurance, without once reaching for the comfortable, easy thing a man can say when a woman tells him something difficult in order to make himself feel he has done something about it. He listened with the complete, unhurried attention of a man who understands that listening is not passive, that there are times when listening is the hardest and most useful thing available. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You think Yarrow being here isn't about my water case," he said finally. "You think Vetch needed a circuit presence in this territory, and the water case was the benefit, not the reason." "Yes," she said. "I think your 6 years of losing in his court was an advantage to someone who needed to establish that Yarrow's rulings carry weight here. And now," he said, "you being here, you think Vetch's man will find you." "I think he already has a general idea," she said. "The Amarillo ticket was purchased in my name. I wasn't as careful as I should have been." She kept her voice flat. This was not a moment for alarm. "I have time. I need to use it." He picked up the survey map she had been looking at. He held it for a moment. He set it down. "What do you need?" he said. "Not what do you want me to do. What do you need?" The distinction mattered to her in a specific place. "I need to get copies of the ledger documentation to a federal contact I have in Santa Fe," she said. "A man named Aldrich who was my father's colleague and who is outside Yarrow's circuit. I need to go through your territorial filings and document every discrepancy that maps to the same pattern I found in Declan's records." She paused. "And I need to know whether there is anyone in this territory who could corroborate the financial records from a source independent of the ledger." I was quiet for a moment. "There might be," he said. "A man named Finch. He was Hennessy's bookkeeper until they let him go under disputed circumstances 3 years ago. He relocated to Cimarron." He met her eyes. "I don't know if he'd talk." "He might," she said, "if someone asked him the right question." Garrett looked at her. "You're doing it already," he said. "Doing what?" "Finding the angle," he said. He said it in the way of a man reporting what he sees rather than performing the observation. "Finding the way through. Even now telling me the problem you're already working the problem. I've been watching you do it for a week." He stopped as though the sentence had come out at a slightly different angle than he had aimed for. "I mean to say I find that useful, having someone near who thinks that way." She did not make anything of it. She was learning his grammar, a man who approached the true statement carefully, sometimes arriving at it directly and sometimes finding it by way of the adjacent statement, trusting the listener to follow. She was following very carefully. "I'll need a week," she said. "Maybe 10 days, to build the documentary record." "Then you have it," he said. The days that followed had the particular quality of a camp being established. Purposeful movement, the quiet accumulation of pattern. Two people learning the specific geography of sharing a space without having decided in advance what the space was for. She rose before dawn and worked at the kitchen table in the thin, early light before the household came to life, cross-referencing Declan's annotated ledger pages against Garrett's territorial filings, building the chain of documentation with the methodical precision her father had drilled into her. She was looking for the same thing she had found in Declan's records, not just evidence of fraud, but evidence of pattern. A single altered filing is a clerical error. Three altered filings with matching date discrepancies, matching margin notations, and matching beneficiary shell entities are something else entirely. She found the pattern by the third day. It was neater than Declan's Kansas case, and uglier for it. Whoever had constructed the Hennessy filing had learned from earlier work, had covered the most obvious trails, had distributed the alterations across multiple documents rather than concentrating them. But the methodology was the same shell structure, the same approach to the survey marker duplication, and unmistakably the same handwriting in three different margin notations, a handwriting she recognized from two of the Dodge City documents in Declan's ledger. She sat back from the table and breathed. The same hand that had falsified documents in Kansas had falsified documents here. It was not two frauds. It was one fraud extended across multiple territories by a man who had made himself powerful enough in each that no single territorial court could safely rule against him. She wrote to Aldrich in Santa Fe that afternoon through the postal rider who came through Cutter's Fork on Wednesdays. She wrote carefully in the surveying notation shorthand. Her father had taught her the private code he had given her along with his surveying tools, and his belief that the most valuable knowledge is the kind that belongs only to you until you choose to share it. She was beginning to choose. Garrett went to see Finch on a Thursday. He rode out in the early morning without ceremony and came back in the late afternoon with mud on his boots and the careful expression of a man who has heard something significant and is deciding how much of it to say at once. He talked, Garrett said. They were in the barn. She was checking the south mare's near foreleg, which had been favoring it since Tuesday. She did not look up. "All of it," she said. "More than I expected." He leaned against the stall door. Finch kept a parallel set of records when he worked for Hennessy, his own copies written in a personal shorthand. A pause. "He's been sitting on them for 3 years waiting for a reason to use them. He has the original payment records. Outgoing transfers to a holding company called Mesa Territorial Properties," Garrett said. "Quarterly, for 9 years. Eliza straightened and turned. "That name," she said. "It's in your ledger." "Yes," she said. "Third shell entity in the Kansas chain." She pressed her hand flat against her ribs for a moment, the automatic gesture she had developed over 11 days of carrying the ledger. "It's the same structure, Sam." It was the first time she had used his given name. She heard it happen, and so did he, a small shift in the air of the barn, neither of them remarking on it. "One fraud," he said. "One fraud, multiple territories, one architect." She looked at the mare's leg without seeing it. If Finch's records match the ledger, if the payment amounts and dates align, then we have independent corroboration. Inside records from Kansas and inside records from New Mexico, both pointing to the same source. That's the kind of evidence that interests a federal court. "Will Finch testify?" "If he believes the federal contact is outside Yarrow's reach," she said, "I think I can make him believe it. I've been writing to Aldrich for a week. He's the kind of man Yarrow cannot touch, and more importantly, he's the kind of man who knows how to make that visible." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "You've been doing this since before you told me about the ledger," he said. "I was building the foundation before I put weight on it," she said. "It's how my father taught me to work a survey. Establish the perimeter before you touch the interior." He looked at her steadily. "I should have had someone who thought like that 6 years ago," he said. "You have someone who thinks like that now," she said. She said it matter-of-factly, meaning it as a practical statement, and meaning it, she admitted to herself in the honest part of her mind that she kept carefully away from the operational part as something else as well. He held her gaze for a fraction of a second longer than the practical statement required. Then he pushed off the stall door and went to check the north water line, which he did every evening, and she turned back to the mare's foreleg and the barn was quiet around them, and she thought, I am in considerable trouble here, and I would not change it. The 10th day a stranger came to town. She was in the general store on a cold November morning, selecting thread with the focused attention of a woman who is actually assessing the street visible through the front window when she saw him. Medium height, city clothes, impractical for the territory. A stillness about him that was not the stillness of a man at ease, but the stillness of a man monitoring. He was standing at the far end of the plaza, with his hat angled against the November sun, watching the stage depot with the methodical patience of professional surveillance. She had seen him before, not here, in Abilene, outside the federal land building on a September afternoon 3 weeks before Declan died. She set the thread down. She kept her face entirely still. She paid what was in her basket and walked out and found Garrett loading grain at the wagon. We should go, she said quietly. He looked at her. One look and his expression reorganized itself into the specific focused attention she had learned to recognize as his version of readiness. No questions, no managing responses. All right, he said. They were out of town in 8 minutes. She told him on the road straight and level. The man from Abilene, what it meant, how much time she estimated they had. He drove in silence for a full mile. She waited. It'll take him a day, maybe two, to establish you're at the ranch, Garrett said. Aldecoa knows you're there. Borrego at the livery knows you're there. He'll ask the right questions and get the right answers. Yes, she said, which is why I'm going to use the day. He looked at her. What do you need from me, he said. Ride to Finch this afternoon, she said. Not to ask him anything more. To tell him that we're moving, that if he intends to provide his records for federal use, the window is 2 days. She paused. And I need you to think about who in this territory you trust with your life. Not your business, your life. He thought about it honestly, which meant he thought about it for a real amount of time and did not produce a quick, comfortable answer. Aldecoa, he said, and a federal marshal named Creasy who works out of Cimarron. Creasy is not in Yarrow's network. He's made that clear in ways that have cost him. Another pause. He owes me a favor, a significant one. Would he ride to Santa Fe with documentation, she said. I think Garrett said he'd be glad of the reason. Eliza spent that evening, the way she spent every evening. She needed to think clearly at the kitchen table after Rosie was in bed with the lamp turned up and the paper spread in front of her and the night outside pressing against the windows. She went through the complete record of what she had assembled. The ledger pages, the territorial filing discrepancies, the documented pattern of altered survey markers, the shell company chain, the margin notation handwriting analysis she had written out in her father's shorthand. She organized it into 2 complete sets, originals and copies, and wrote a summary document in plain language that any federal attorney could read in one sitting and understand entirely. She cross-referenced Finch's records, which Garrett had brought back from Cimarron the week before, against Declan's annotated entries. The payment amounts matched, the dates aligned. The shell company transfers appeared in both sets of records from the sending end and the receiving end, independently documented by 2 men who had never met each other. It was not circumstance. It was proof. She sealed the original packet and wrote Aldrich's name on it in her father's notation. Then she sat for a long time looking at the lamp. She had been carrying the ledger against her ribs for more than 3 weeks. It had become in that time so much a part of her physical awareness that she sometimes forgot it was there until she breathed too deeply and felt the edge of the oilskin. It had been the center of her world since October. The thing she was running from, the thing she was protecting, the thing she was trying to bring to the place where it could do what it was made to do. Tomorrow she would give the originals to Marshal Creasy and send them north to Santa Fe. It was not the ending. It was the beginning of the end, which was different. Vetch would fight. Vetch had money and connections and lawyers in Washington, and the specific invulnerability of a man who had never yet been caught. But Aldrich in Santa Fe was one of the few people in this territory whose jurisdiction and integrity both lay entirely outside the network Vetch had built. And a federal case opened by Aldrich with 2 independent documentary sources was a thing that could not be quietly closed. She had built it the way her father built surveys, from the perimeter inward, establishing the whole before the parts, making sure the foundation held before she put her weight on it. It held. She closed the packet. Garrett came in from checking the horses, which he did every night before the household went dark. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her still at the table, and then he came in and sat across from her, which was not something he had done this late before, And the fact that he did it without preamble, as though it were simply what happened now, was not something she allowed herself to examine at any length. Creasy will be here tomorrow morning, he said. Good, she said. He looked at the sealed packet. Is it enough, he said. It's more than enough, she said. Two independent documentary records, both internally consistent, both corroborating the same chain of fraud from two different directions. And the margin notation handwriting links the Kansas alterations directly to the New Mexico filings. She pressed the packet flat. Vetch will try to delay the federal proceedings. He's very good at delay, but this is already too large to make disappear. Garrett was quiet for a moment. That's not what I was asking, he said. She looked at him. He had the expression she was learning to read at increasing accuracy, the one that contained things he hadn't finished assembling into language yet, but was no longer working to conceal from her. The lamplight sat between them, and the night outside was cold and still, and she thought about what he was actually asking, and thought about whether she was ready to answer it honestly. I don't know yet, she said. Whether it's enough, for everything. Fair, he said. I came here with a plan, she said. The plan was practical. Survive, keep moving, find somewhere to set the weight down. The plan didn't account for... She stopped. Didn't account for what, he said. She looked at the lamp. For finding something worth staying for, she said. That wasn't part of the plan. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved off the Cimarron brakes, with the dry, clean smell of high desert night. When Declan died, Garrett said, I won't ask you how you felt, but I want to know if you were all right. Not managing all right, actually. She thought about this honestly. Not for a while, she said. Not because the marriage it wasn't what I had thought it would be, but because I had been trying to make it into something workable for 3 years, and when he died, I lost the project. She paused. He was a man who managed me carefully. He meant it kindly. I think he was genuinely sorry for it by the end. She looked at her hands on the sealed packet. He gave me the ledger. He said I was capable. He said it with considerably more conviction than he'd ever showed me directly, which told me something. A pause. He was right that I was capable. He was also the reason I'd spent 3 years forgetting I was. Garrett said nothing for a long moment. He turned his coffee cup on the table, once not drinking from it, just the small movement of a man who needs something to do with his hands while he is deciding something. I had a wife, he said. I don't tell people she left. I tell people she died because the truth is a certain kind of complicated I haven't known how to say plainly. He looked at the table. Her name was Marguerite. She hated the territory. She told me that the second winter, and I thought she'd adapt, and she told me the third winter, and I thought she was going through something temporary, and she left the fourth winter. And I don't blame her anymore, but I blame myself for a long time for building a life that only had room for the life I wanted. And Rosie, she said. Rosie was 4, he said. Marguerite offered to take her. Rosie, he stopped. Rosie would not go. I know that's an extraordinary thing to say about a 4-year-old, but it's true. She planted her feet and she said, no, Papa, and that was the end of it. He looked at the window. I told people she died because I was ashamed of having failed so completely that the honest account was worse than the lie. Rosie knows, Eliza said. He looked at her. She's known for at least 2 years, Eliza said. She manages you about it very carefully. She doesn't bring up things that make you close off. She gives you space when you're working through something. She watches you the way a person watches something they're trying to keep from breaking. She paused. She's 11 years old, and she's been running this household's emotional weather since she was 9. He was quiet for a very long time. I should talk to her, he said finally. Yes, she said. She'll handle it better than you think. She handles most things better than you'd think because you underestimate her, because she looks like you, and you underestimate yourself. Something shifted in his face. Not the almost smile, though it was adjacent. Something more like the expression of a man who has been handed an unexpected map to a place he had given up trying to find. How do you do that, he said. Do what? Say the accurate thing, not the kind thing or the diplomatic thing, the accurate thing. He looked at her steadily. In my experience, most people choose one or the other. My father believed they were the same thing, she said. In the end, he said the kindest thing you could do for a person was see them correctly. He held her gaze. I see you, he said, plainly, directly, without ceremony or embellishment, meaning it entirely. She had not been seen, not actually seen, in 3 years of marriage and 11 days of running. She sat in the lamplight in the kitchen of a man she had known for 16 days, with the sealed packet under her hands and the cold outside pressing against the windows, and she thought, this is dangerous, and I would not trade it. I know, she said. I know you do. He reached across his table. He took her hand, briefly, directly, without performance, and then released it, and picked up his coffee cup and said, in the matter-of-fact voice of a man returning to the world of practical necessity, you should sleep. Tomorrow needs thinking through. I know, she said. She did not move immediately. She sat for a moment longer, looking at the lamp, thinking about accurate things and what it meant to be seen by someone who was looking at what was actually there. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep quickly. She lay in the east-facing room and listened to the desert, the wind in the chamisa, the distant coyote, the horses shifting in the corral, and she thought about the sealed packet on the kitchen table and the man at the other end of the house, who would, she was quite certain, also not be sleeping quickly, and she thought that some situations were only fully comprehensible from the inside, and that being inside this one did not frighten her. It had been a long time since something had not frightened her. Marshal Creasy arrived before sunrise, as agreed, with the specific, unhurried purposefulness of a man who has been waiting for a justification to do something and is satisfied to finally have one. He was perhaps 50, weathered past his years with a federal badge and the careful, deliberate manner of someone who has survived long enough to stop performing anything. Eliza handed him the packet. I took it. He looked at her with the frank, direct assessment of a person measuring something real. He said, Aldrich is a good man. If this is what you say it is, he'll move. It's what I say it is, she said. I don't doubt it, he said. He tucked the packet inside his coat with the automatic care of a man for whom transporting important things safely is a practiced skill. He looked at Garrett. Tell Aldecoa to watch the South Road. Vetch's man may try to intercept before I reach the Santa Fe Junction. I'll tell him, Garrett said. Creasy mounted and was gone in the gray pre-dawn dark, riding north at a pace that said, this matters and I know it. Eliza stood in the yard and watched the sound of his horse disappear into the desert quiet. It's done, she said. The original is moving. Garrett stood beside her, not touching, just present in the way he had come to be present, which was the way the mesa was present, the way the windmill was present, not obtruding itself, but simply being what it was, reliably in the same place, doing what it was built to do. Now we wait, he said. Now we work, she said. The waiting and the working happen at the same time. I've found that's the best arrangement. He looked at her sideways in the gray morning, and the almost smile was fully present this time, contained but visible in the specific lines around his eyes, and she thought, there it is, and thought, there you are. Vetch's man appeared at the ranch 3 days later. She knew before he rode through the gate. She had been watching the South Road from the kitchen window since dawn, and when the single rider appeared on the long approach, she felt the cold, specific clarity of a person who has been preparing for a thing and now recognizes its arrival. She stood at the window for exactly 5 seconds. Then she went to the shelf where the copies of the documentation were kept, touched the leather portfolio with one hand, and went outside. Garrett came from the barn as the man dismounted. He had been working on the tack, and he did not set down the bridle. He was mending, and he did not look like a man who had been watching the road, and he positioned himself in the yard in the practiced, unremarkable way of someone who is exactly where he needs to be and has no reason to announce it. The man's name was Price. She knew it. He had been at the Abilene Federal Building the day she went to examine Declan's office records, standing in the hallway with the relaxed professional absence of someone paid to be invisible and moderately good at it. He was not particularly good at it here. Mrs. Holt, he said. He had the particular courtesy of a man who has been instructed that the approach should be soft. I'm glad we found you. There's been concern. I'm sure there has, she said pleasantly. The congressman was very fond of your husband, Price said. He feels a responsibility. You left Abilene so quickly there was no opportunity to help you through the estate matters. The estate matters are resolved, she said. The federal filing is complete. A pause. Calibrating. There are documents, he said carefully, belonging to the estate, certain records that Declan was maintaining on behalf of the land office. The congressman is concerned they might be misfiled, that they'd cause confusion in the wrong hands. They won't be confused, she said. They're in Santa Fe with Federal Attorney Aldrich. I sent them 4 days ago. She watched his face with the specific attention of someone who has been watching faces for tactical information for 3 weeks. He's been reading them since yesterday morning, I expect. He reads quickly. The calibration happened again. slower this time. She watched him assess the new landscape, find it different from the one he had prepared for begin, looking for the angle that still gave Vetch something. He found it. This property, Price said. He looked at the ranch with the assessing gaze of someone who has just located leverage. Mr. Garrett's water dispute, the Hennessy easement, is fraudulently filed, Garrett said. His voice was entirely even. He had not looked up from the bridle, as the documentation with Aldrich demonstrates in considerable detail. The same hand that altered the Kansas land grant filings altered the Hennessy survey markers. He looked up. The territorial judge who ruled on that easement is named in the federal complaint. His rulings in this territory are under review. He paused. Is there something else? Price looked from one of them to the other. She watched him complete the assessment. She had been waiting for him to complete the recognition that the situation was not the one he had been dispatched to manage. He had ridden here expecting a frightened woman with a ledger she didn't know how to use. He had found instead a woman who had spent 3 weeks building a case she very much knew how to use with a federal attorney already in receipt of it, and a man beside her who could not be bullied or bought, and who was standing in his own yard with the specific placid steadiness of someone who does not need to demonstrate that this is his ground because the demonstration is not required. The congressman, Price began, has been named in a federal complaint, she said, along with the holding companies, the shell entity chain, and the relevant circuit judges. This is a matter that is now in federal hands outside the circuits in question. I want you to understand that clearly. She paused. There is nothing here to collect. There is nothing here to negotiate. There is nothing left for you to prevent. Price stood in the yard for another moment. Then he mounted. He rode south without speaking again. Eliza stood in the yard and breathed. The Cimarron brakes went amber in the November afternoon, and the windmill turned its patient arcs, and beside her, Garrett finally set down the bridle and came to stand at her shoulder with the quiet directness of someone who has said what needs to be said by being exactly where he is. He'll report back, she said. Yes, he said. Vetch will contest. He has lawyers who do nothing else. I know. This is not finished. No, he said. But today it is. Rosie appeared in the doorway of the house. She looked at the retreating rider and then at her father and Eliza with the level, comprehensive gaze of a child who has been monitoring this household's progress with the thoroughness she applied to everything that mattered to her. Is he gone? She said. For now, Garrett said. Rosie looked from him to Eliza and back. Something in her expression resolved the particular organization of a face that has been braced for an outcome and received the right one. Good, she said, and went back inside. The weeks after Price's departure had the quality of a long breath slowly released. Not peace, she was not so unguarded as to call it peace, but the particular absence of immediate danger, which is its own form of rest. Aldrich wrote from Santa Fe on a Wednesday the federal case was open, the documentation was in official custody, the holding company chain was under active review. He wrote also Vetch will contest every step. Do not ease your vigilance. She told Garrett that evening. He listened with his particular completeness. Then how long? Months, she said. Maybe longer. The Washington lawyers will find procedural delays. He's very good at slow. But it's open, Garrett said. It's open, she said. It's in federal hands and it can't be quietly closed. He nodded once. He was quiet. Then all right. She had learned by now the full grammar of that phrase. It was not resignation. It was the deliberate act of a man who takes the shape of a thing and places it in its correct position and gets up the next morning to do what the morning requires. She found it privately one of the most useful qualities she had encountered in anyone. The Yarrow rulings on the water case went under immediate review by the federal circuit. The Hennessy enforcement claim was suspended. She told him that at breakfast. He looked at the wall where his survey map still hung. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said quietly, 6 years. She let him have the silence. 6 years farming around a constraint that wasn't real, he said. The constraint was real enough to cost you 6 years, she said. The harm was real. The land didn't know the documents were false. The grass didn't grow any better because the survey markers were fabricated. She paused. I'm angry about that on your behalf. I'm trying to manage the expression of it. He turned and looked at her. You don't have to manage it, he said. She looked at him steadily. You can be angry here, he said. There's room for it. She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about 4 years of a marriage in which certain feelings were not permitted, in which her anger was a problem to be solved, in which she had managed herself with such thoroughness that she sometimes could not locate the unmanaged thing beneath. He was offering her permission to find it. I know, she said. Thank you. He turned back to the maps and she stood beside him, and they were quietly and specifically angry on each other's behalf, which is one of the more useful things two people can do together. December came to the Cimarron breaks with a bone-dry cold, and nights so clear the stars had a hard quality to them, brilliant and closed the sky, enormous and indifferent, and entirely theirs. On an evening 3 weeks into December, Garrett pushed back from the table and said, I want to tell you something about Marguerite. Something I haven't told anyone because it made me look like a man who failed at the most important thing he tried. She set down her pen. She gave him the same quality of attention he had given her. He told her, not the managed version, not the version designed to make him the wrong party or the sympathetic one. The honest version, a man who had loved his wife in the way that makes sense to a man whose life is land and work, and the concrete satisfaction of built things, who had not understood until very late that there are people for whom that language is not enough, and who had responded to her unhappiness by building more things because building was the only vocabulary he had. By the third winter, I knew she was going to leave, he said. I built a new smokehouse that winter. I think I was trying to give her a reason to stay by giving her something solid, as though solid was what she needed. He was quiet for the moment. She needed a world with other people in it. I had built a world with just us in it and called it devotion. Eliza looked at the lamp. What you just told me, she said. That was an honest account, without making yourself the victim and without making her the villain. Just what happened and what you didn't understand and what it cost. She paused. If you told Rosie that version, she'd understand. She already knows more than you think she does. She's been protecting you about it for at least 2 years. He looked at her. Protecting me, he said. She learned what your household required, Eliza said carefully. She learned you needed to be protected from certain things, and she did what children do in that circumstance. She became the person the household needed. She held his gaze. That's not a failure of hers, but you should be the one to release her from it. He was quiet for a long time. Then I wasn't sure when you said you wanted to stay, whether you meant the practical arrangement or something else. She looked at him steadily. Something else, she said. He held her gaze and the lamplight held steady between them, and outside the Cimarron breaks held the cold in their red stone, and the windmill held its patient course in the dark. And she thought about the word partnership, which she had read in an advertisement on a stage platform in Amarillo, and had cut out with a penknife and kept, and which was, she understood now, the smallest word for the largest thing she had found here. I'm not easy to be with, he said. I know that. I'm slow. I manage myself. I'm not quick with words or feelings. I know you're not quick, she said. I've been watching you manage yourself since October. It's one of the things about you. She paused. My husband was quick. His quickness was how he stayed ahead of me, always just faster than I could follow, so that I was always responding to where he already was, rather than thinking for myself. She looked at the table. Slow, I know how to trust. Slow, I know how to move alongside. He took her hand across the table, simply directly, and held it for the length of a breath and then a little longer. All right, he said. All right, she said. They went back to their papers, and outside the wind moved off the breaks and the stars burned their hard, brilliant cold above the Cimarron country, and inside the kitchen was warm and the lamp was steady, and that was enough. He talked to Rosie on a Friday evening while Eliza sat in her room with the door not entirely closed, listening to the rhythm of it without the words. Cole's voice careful and low. Rosie's responses less frequent than usual. 20 minutes. Then the sound of a man in the kitchen who needs something to do with his hands after something hard. The coffee pot moved, the stove stirred. She gave him 10 minutes. Then she went to the kitchen. Howe was at the table looking at the window that faced north. How did she take it? Eliza said. She said she already knew, he said. She said she'd known since she was 9. He turned the cup. She said she hadn't told me because she was afraid of how I'd take it. She was protecting you, Eliza said. 10 years old, he said, managing my feelings about her own mother. It's not a failure of hers, Eliza said. You know what it is, and knowing is the beginning of changing it. He looked up at her. She asked, he said, whether you were going to stay. The kitchen clock ticked. The fire settled. What did you tell her? Eliza said. I told her I hope so, he said. I told her I was working on it. She held his gaze across the table. That's a reasonable answer, she said. Is it enough, he said. For now, she said. Ask me again in spring. The almost smile came fully to his eyes. She had been cataloging it for weeks, learning its different qualities. This one was warm and certain and did not require management. Spring, he said. All right. The formal federal charges against Congressman Harlan Vetch were filed on a Tuesday in late February. 14 counts: fraud, bribery, theft from public land grant funds, conspiracy to falsify federal survey records, manipulation of circuit court appointments for financial benefit. The documentation named the holding company chain across 3 territories, the margin notation handwriting analysis that connected the Kansas filings to the New Mexico alterations, and the independent corroboration of the payment records from 2 sources who had never communicated with each other. Marshal Creasy rode out to the ranch to tell them personally. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and looked like a man setting down something he had been carrying a long way. The Yarrow rulings are vacated, he said. The territorial water case is referred to the federal circuit for fresh review. Thank you, Creasy, Garrett said. The marshal put his hat back on. He looked at Eliza. You did something considerable here, he said. Several people did, she said. I had help. He rode away, and she stood in the yard in the February morning and looked at the brakes going amber in the early light, the chamisa already beginning to show the first green of the year's return. And she thought about a woman pressing an oilskin ledger against her ribs in a dark Abilene room, and telling herself that time and distance and a room facing east were enough to begin. She had been right about that. She went inside. On a Wednesday in late March, Garrett read the formal water rights ruling at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him. He read it once all the way through. Then he set it down. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. 6 years, he said. She waited. 6 years keeping the North Range light because I couldn't count on the spring, he said. Not putting the fence line all the way to the east flat because the whole thing felt like it could be pulled out from under me any morning. He looked at the ruling. That east meadow. I've never used it the way it deserves. What would you do with it, she said. He looked up at her. His expression was the one she had been trying to name since November and had finally stopped trying to name, because it was its own thing. The specific look of a man who has been braced for a very long time and is allowing himself carefully and with some disbelief to let his shoulders down. In spring, he said, I'd like to ride up and look at it. What it could be. He paused. I'd like you to come. She understood he was not entirely talking about the meadow. Yes, she said. I'd like that very much. He held her gaze for a moment steady and warm and without management, and then he looked back at the ruling in front of him, and she watched him place his weight on the new reality and find it solid. Spring came to the Cimarron breaks with the particular ferocity of a desert that has been dry for months and knows it. The chamisa bloomed yellow along the trail. The cottonwoods in the east draws broke into silver green. The sky went to that deep, uncompromising blue that has no equivalent in flat country, the blue that belongs to altitude and open space and nothing else. They rode to the North Meadow on a Saturday, all 3 of them. Garrett and Eliza and Rosie on a pony, the girl riding ahead on the Breaks Trail with the boneless confidence of someone who was entirely at home in this landscape and had been since she could sit a horse. The meadow was greener than Eliza had expected. The spring ran clear along the east face, and the grass had come in along its full length, new and thick, and the cottonwood stand was full-leafed and turning silver in the late morning breeze. Rosie ran ahead to crouch at the water's edge in the traditional manner of children whose boots are about to get wet. Garrett walked to the section of fence line that ran along the meadow's eastern boundary and stopped there looking at it. He had the expression of a man surveying something he has planned for a very long time, and is still in this moment uncertain quite how to believe in it. She came and stood beside him. The east fence should be finished by June, she said. Reyes's crew works fast. He turned and looked at her. You check the posts, he said. I like to know the state of things, she said. It's a habit. He looked back at the meadow, at the grass in the spring and the cottonwood stand, and the breaks rising amber and red beyond. At the land he had been farming around for 6 years, that had always been his, that had been made inaccessible by a fraud that was now fully documented, fully prosecuted, and finally resolved. Come here, he said. She turned. He reached up and tucked a strand of wind-loosened hair back from her face with the careful, deliberate touch of a man who does not make gestures. He doesn't mean whose hands calloused and quiet and entirely real know exactly what they are doing. He let his hand rest for a moment at her jaw. He looked at her with the expression she had stopped trying to name because naming it would be, she had decided, somehow smaller than simply receiving it. You are not merely workable, he said. She laughed. She could not help it, genuine and quick and surprised out of her. Sam Garrett, she said, that is the strangest thing a man has ever said to a woman. It's the truest thing I know how to say, he said. I mean it as the highest. Then I'll take it, she said. As the highest. He bent his head and kissed her, not a tentative thing, not a first attempt, but the deliberate act of a man who has thought about it for long enough and has now done it with the same direct intention he brought to everything, completely without performance meaning it entirely. She kissed him back with the same intention. Below, from somewhere along the spring, Rosie's voice floated up. If you're finished, the pony is eating the cottonwood again. Garrett pulled back. He looked at his daughter's voice with the expression she had learned was his version of happiness. The quiet contained entirely genuine warmth of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. Which pony? He called back. Mine, Rosie said with immense patience. She always does this. You know she does this. I know she does this, he said. I took Eliza's hand and they walked back across the meadow together. Below, the ranch waited with its windmill turning in the morning breeze and its east-facing window catching the light small and solid against the red earth built to last. She looked at it. She thought about a stage platform in Amarillo with an advertisement in her hand and a practical plan that had accounted for survival and not for this. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere. She tightened her hand in his. Sam, she said. Yes, we're going to be all right. He was quiet for a moment. In the way he was quiet about things, he was certain of the things that did not require his voice to make them true. I know, he said. Above them, the spring sky held its patient, enormous blue. The Cimarron breaks ran red and amber north and south as far as they could see. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles on the warm thermals at ease in the open air, entirely at home. They rode back through the morning, through the sage and the chamisa and the red country, spreading wide in every direction. And when the ranch came up to meet them, she felt it, the weight lifted. Not all weight there would be hard days. She knew that the federal case would be slow, and Vetch would fight every step, but the particular weight she had been carrying since October. The weight of the ledger against her ribs, the weight of running, the weight of a woman who had not been permitted to be fully herself for 3 years, and then had been afraid to be for the 3 weeks after. The weight of arriving somewhere and not knowing yet if she was allowed to stay. She was allowed. She had chosen. The choosing had been real. She was home. The leather portfolio she had carried all the way from Abilene had been sitting on the kitchen shelf since February when the originals went to Santa Fe. It had no particular use now. But Rosie had noticed it one afternoon and asked about it with the direct curiosity of a child who notices things, and Eliza had told her plainly, and in the simplified version that is not dishonest, but is appropriate for 11, what it had contained and why it had mattered. Rosie had listened with her father's complete attention. Then she had said, so it's why you're here. Partly, Eliza said. The rest is your father. And you. Rosie had thought about this for a while in the way she thought about things she was placing in their permanent positions. It should stay on the shelf, Rosie said. So we remember. Yes, Eliza said. I think that's right. It stayed on the shelf. And on the day in April when Garrett came in from the North Meadow with mud on his boots and his hat pushed back and the expression of a man who has been thinking about something all morning and has arrived at the end of the thinking. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her at the table with the survey maps of the East Flat spread out before her, and she looked up at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, I was thinking when we filed the partnership papers, the formal arrangement, I was thinking we should use your father's name somewhere. As a middle name, maybe, if that's agreeable to you. Crane. What he taught you is a considerable part of what brought you here. She looked at him. Crane, she said. Yes. She held his gaze. I'd like that. He came in and sat down beside her and looked at the survey maps, and she moved the papers to make room for him, and they worked together in the April afternoon light with the wind off the brakes, coming through the open window, clean and warm, carrying the smell of new chamisa and runoff water, and the first suggestion of the season turning. The portfolio sat on the shelf. The windmill turned. The east window held the light. And whatever came next, she would face it from here on land. She considered hers beside a man she had chosen in a house where the choosing was every day renewed, not dramatically, not declared to anyone, but in the steady, quiet way that real things endure, like the mesa, like the sky, like the patience of water finding its way through red stone. Like two people who had both been alone for a long time and had, against all practical planning, found each other entirely.